My paranormal experiences began when I was about 4 or 5 years old. We had just moved from my original childhood home, which is what my mother had always described as the happiest years of her marriage and our lives. We left the house because the landlord needed a place for his family to stay. We went from living in this beautiful country home to the house that changed my life forever. It was just a rinky-dink little trailer in the middle of nowhere, and I loved the land. The land was beautiful, but I hated the house. We had roughly 9 acres of prairie land. I loved playing outside any moment I could. We had gardens and chickens, and would rent the pasture to the neighbors' horses. So in that aspect, there were charmed parts of my childhood. I don't know when it started, but my mom and dad and my dad's entire side of the family had a pretty substantial drug addiction. And I won't get into all the different kinds, but alcoholism and heavy-duty drug addiction were entered into the house when I was very little age. I remember things being wrong, but not really knowing what. In this old little trailer, the way it was set up, you would walk in the front door, and to the right would be the bedroom my brother and I shared for a good long while until we were just so sick of each other we just couldn't be in the same room together anymore. And then right across from the front door was my mom and dad's bedroom, because trailers are big, long, rectangular sort of deals. So if you went off to the left-hand side when you walked in the front door would be the living room, and on the other far end of the house was my father's music room. Music was a big part of my family. I grew up, no matter how bad things really got, we always connected through music. My dad was a musician. My mom was a singer. So there was a lot of music in my life too. That was another charmed part of my childhood. A lot of it was very rough though. We were extremely poor. I've been able to talk about my trauma now, but I can't talk about this part. It's really difficult to be like, hey, here's my messed up childhood, and also ghosts. But I remember it was right around kindergarten. We moved into this place and I hated it. I just hated it right away. I don't remember why, but it bothered my father so much, but I would always want to sleep next to my mom. And the first thing I ever remember seeing, and it's still in my brain so clearly, is I remember looking up at the ceiling and there was this figure, and it was like the size of an infant. It was small and it was black and smoky and kind of nebulous in the way it was shaped. And it had 2 bright glowing red eyes. And I just remember staring at it and it staring back at me, and it would just go and swoop in circles slowly around the light fixture above me. And I still remember what the light fixtures looked like. They were square and really thin, cheap glass with florals etched onto them, and they were all over the house. And I just remember staring at it, and I remember trying to get my mother's attention. And I remember whisper screaming, like, Mom, and I was just frozen otherwise. And that was the first thing I had saw. And the house always had just kind of a bad vibe to it. And there's some interesting stuff about that I'll get into later. And then it became the first thing I remember hearing that shouldn't have been there. Down the road from us was one of my very good childhood friends' family farm. It was a really great place. It was kind of just like a really rough and tumble little farm. And there was a creek out back that we would tire swing into. It was very picturesque, very Midwestern. It was a great place to hang out. And I remember being really little and hanging out at her house and kind of wandering off on the property. And there was this tiny little abandoned house. There was no door on it. It was just like this weird little house. And it just kind of, the roof caved in, hollow windows, and just like one kind of small room. And I remember kind of being by myself and kind of spending some time there. And then that night, when I had went home, I remember hearing the first voice I would hear. And I've never been able to find, it was like that house didn't exist. I could never find it again. I saw it once on her property and it just doesn't exist. That night, I remember laying in my bed, and it was already a creepy house, and I would always sleep with like my blankets very close to my face and around my ears. And I hear this little girl's voice trailing off, and it's so close to my ear. She sounds like she's my age, which must have been like, 5, 6. And it was just like, Margot. And then 2 more times, that same tone of Margot. And the 3rd time, it just trailed off into nothingness. Just Margot. And I remember being frozen and terrified and thinking that if I looked out of my blankets, I was going to see someone I didn't want to see. And then it was like a floodgate had opened. Every night I would hear random voices, and it was like different kinds of people coming in and out, and they were always talking about different things. And so I remember one of the next voices I had, it was some man rambling about our forefathers fought for this and that and all this. And I remember just kind of laying there going, what is going on? And I didn't want to look because I was too scared. And eventually it got to a point where I was even frustrated. And this is up until the point where I'm probably about 7, 8, 9, just constantly would hear talking. Eventually my brother and I got separate bedrooms. I got my mom and dad's old room where I saw the baby on the ceiling, which is always what I called it, was the baby, because my brother was sick of me. So I got my own room at about 7. I was very meticulous with how my toys were arranged. I don't know why. We didn't have a lot of really nice, expensive things. So the things I did have, I had to have like displayed in such a way that it was visually pleasing to me. And I've always been that kind of person. But I would constantly find them rearranged. I would constantly find things where they shouldn't be. My parents wouldn't do that. I don't know. It was just over a period of years, I'll kind of surmise what happened and then kind of go into detail on some of the worst things that happened. But it was constant. My bed would lift and drop in the middle of the night. That would happen almost nightly. Sometimes the bed would violently shake, like vibrate. And I remember I would climb off of the bed and I would touch the floor, and the floor would be perfectly still, but the bed would be shaking still. It was just a constant hearing people talking in my room, pacing back and forth by my bed at night. But the day I moved into the bedroom and had it for the first time, I'll never forget, because I thought I was so fancy because I got licensed Princess Jasmine Disney sheets. And I just thought that that was the epitome of wealth at the time, my little 7-year-old self. And I was setting up my nice bed and I was putting stuff away in my closet, middle of the day, and sitting in the back of my closet in the middle of the day is the baby, except for it's bigger now. It's like my size. And it's got those 2 bright, glowing red eyes. And I just froze and I'm staring at it and it's staring at me. It reaches its hand out like to swipe at my face, and then whoosh, flies like its whole body flew backwards into the wall of the closet and disappeared. To this day, my brother remembers me coming out and yelling about the thing in my closet. He remembers the day that that happened. And my parents just always thought it was for attention. It would take years to realize what had actually all happened in that house. But one of the things that always remained consistent was I know that other people have seen what I've seen. And we didn't have any internet, anything like that. I didn't have an outside influence. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have that means of communication. So when I would grow older to find that these things were happening to other people, it did become sort of a lifelong obsession. One night, I remember falling asleep on the couch, and I must have been about 7. It wasn't shortly after I had moved into my bedroom. and had seen the thing in my closet. We always had the hall light on and our doors open because we liked the light. I especially, because of all the weird things I had seen in my room. And they were mostly concentrated in my room. I felt the sensation of being lifted and slowly, easily kind of being woken. And I thought my dad must be carrying me to bed. But I remember the sensation of feeling the distance of the couch to where I'd been lifted seemed much greater than my dad lifting me. And I would open my eyes in the hall light, completely solid, not translucent, not smoky, was a figure whose head almost touched the ceiling light. And it was carrying me, whole on carrying me. And I remember opening my eyes and seeing this cloak, like a hood, like a worn, disheveled, grayish brown, dusty cloak, tall, thin head. It must have been. I didn't see the face, and I thank God. And I just saw this cloaked head and like blocking the ceiling light of the hallway. It was solid. I opened my eyes a little, and it just happens like that. But in the moment, it is just slow-mo. I remember looking up at this kind of little opening where you could kind of see where a face might be, but I can't see anything at the angle. And I remember looking down and seeing its hands on me, carrying me. And it had long, bony, thin, pale fingers. And I remember it had long, pointed, kind of aged or yellowed or, just kind of crusty looking nails. And it was carrying me. And I look up at it, and at some point its head starts to slowly turn like it's going to look at me. And I just shut my eyes and I pretended like I was asleep. In that moment, I had never been more scared in my whole life. I remember it like it was yesterday. And there's so much of my childhood that I don't remember, but I remember these things. It laid me down in my Princess Jasmine sheets, covered me up, and then it put its hand on my head, like almost, I don't know if it was comforting, and its hand covered the entirety of my little head. And I remember peeking enough to seeing its back towards me, my bed's facing the door and the hall light, and I see its back, and I see it duck, kind of its head sideways and go underneath the doorway, and then off to the right and out of sight. And I remember just kind of staring at the doorway and laying there for a good long while and just staring and staring. And then eventually, I don't know how long it was. When you're a kid, time just seems so much more different. Eventually, I had gotten up and I had got up and locked my door. And ever since then, until a few years ago, I had to sleep with a locked door. That's from a point when I was 7 to probably 30. I'm 36 now. I still have to have my door locked at night sometimes if I'm having a PTSD episode. Luckily, I do take something that helps me sleep now, and that's been a godsend. But yeah, for 20 plus years, I had to have my bedroom door locked, always. And for the first few years of my marriage, my husband doesn't even like to lock his front door before. He's incredibly understanding, but yeah, it's affected me. Oh, what a weird house. Gosh. Also, the land it was on, I know behind the house was a big hill, and on the big hill was a big circle of stones, just encompassing the entirety of the top of the hill. And it always had a weird vibe to it. I would find out eventually that a girl I had grown up with around the same area very recently had told me that she had seen little shadow figures with bright orange glowing eyes. A lot of this area, not to mention this nation, is a native burial ground in a large way. So you wonder if some of that heaviness is manifested in all kinds of different ways. So years later, when I was about 18 or 19, Mom had admitted that she had seen the same thing that I had seen in the little shadow person with the bright red eyes. She was ashamed because she was high when she had seen it, and she never admitted to seeing the things that I was talking about. And from as soon as we lived in the house to until I was gone, I was not believed once. It's funny, it took me years to understand why I knew that that thing that carried me to bed, I think it saved me. I loved my dad. He came from an incredibly rough family. They did horrible things to each other growing up. Their mother had done horrible things to them. Anytime I brought up my grandfather, nobody would talk about him. It was like clandestine information, or I would ask about him because I never knew him, and no one would ever tell me anything about him except for he was a trucker. My dad, sober, was so important to me. But my dad, drinking, and on a few different nasty drugs, he didn't understand, I think, what it would do to him or how traumatized he truly was from his childhood. I would find out about a year after his death from stomach cancer that he had abused my brother in the worst way possible that you can a child. And I'm so sorry if that's triggering to anybody. My heart goes out to you. I know a couple of things happened to me. I just never put the pieces together until these last 5 years. And they had a drug dealer who was like family. And he had done something horrible to me once that I can remember. And that's what he did, this drug dealer. He found vulnerable families with little girls, and he would find ways to get into their life, and he would hurt their children. And it's strange because it goes hand in hand with the things that were happening around the house. And for a while, I thought that I had replaced these terrible memories with these ghostly ones. But my family, including my brother, remember when I was reacting to them in that time. When you doubt somebody that's had a strange experience, no matter what it is, I guarantee you that nobody doubts them as much as themselves. It's a hard fight to go back and forth, and because it's not rooted in reality. And it was constant. It was my nightmare for years. And it was a weird house. I found out years later, my mom, when she had moved in, she had found some kind of a bowl with carved symbols in it. That's what she tells me. She's a little eccentric as well. That's the tough thing too, because I have a hard time trusting and believing her sometimes. But I know that I have to, because I don't want her to feel alone in her experiences either. Yeah, a weird bowl with like symbols carved in it and something that looked like some kind of, not ritualistic, but like some kind of like candle-y altar thing. And I remember we had a lot of frozen pipe problems, and eventually my dad like cut a hole in the kitchen floor to get to a plumbing problem. I think this is around the time that I had gotten my own room and weird stuff was just a constant, was this dead, mummified cat swaddled and wrapped up like a baby. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but to me, that screams weird. Why was it buried under the house? Why was it swaddled? That's the part that made me really uncomfortable, is why is it wrapped like an infant? Weird, weird house. But yeah, it just became my nightly routine. I would hear voices, my bed would vibrate, the bed would lift it. And the thing is I wasn't asleep because I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. And it's funny because I know people have a myriad of ideas about what these things are. And that's the hard thing, is if you've either experienced or you're trying to understand someone else's experiences, you're always going to wonder why. And you never get to know. And at some point, I do think that it is important to just kind of accept that you don't always get to know. And I remember not even wanting to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night because things were already so crazy in my little locked room that going all the way across the other end of the house and coming back was just mortifying to me. I couldn't do it. I was so scared. So like I would have bed accidents because I didn't even want to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night because I was so terrified. And that's literally the first time that I've told anyone that. I don't even think I've told my husband that. I mean, it had a weird vibe, the whole land of it. And like I said, I was sort of in love with the prairie itself. And when it would lightning outside, it would seem like the whole valley was lit up in day for a brief second. It was beautiful land, but the house was rotten. And not only that, it was just deteriorating around us at all times. So it was like a metaphor for everything else going on with my mom and dad and the fighting. And it sounds weird, but I sometimes don't even want to blame the things that I saw, because my mom at some point said, well, there are times that your father, I felt he was possessed. And I told her, I said, Mom, I think someday we're just going to have to look back and realize that that was just Dad. But I know it seemed like it definitely must have fed off of it. Sometimes it did seem that it was, I don't know, the shadow things didn't necessarily feel evil. Other things that happened there certainly sort of felt evil. The constant torturing at night and the lifting of my bed and dropping it. Oh God, I remember this time that I was older. Oh yeah, I should mention, I did have a brief period of time when I was probably like getting into 10, 11, where I was playing with a Ouija board with a neighbor girl. I know, great idea. But in one of the times, I think must have been about like 10 or 11. We had just gotten like AOL dial-up. That dates me. But I had been playing with this Ouija board for a while. And this one night, I don't know, it was like saying like, if you're real, prove it, like show up in my bedroom at like whatever time in the morning. I was kind of just being like, you know, giggly, nervous kid, even though like all this screwed up stuff was happening around me. I'm like, there's no way that this thing like actually works. And my brother is like getting antsy because he's like, go to bed, because he's like a 13-year-old with the internet for the first time. So was trying to look at NRT images, which would take him about 8 years to get a photo downloaded, probably back then. But I tried to go to bed, and when I closed the door, there was like one of those outside bright lights on the exterior of the trailer, kind of, you know, I don't know if you ever seen a trailer park and those bright lights. So this bright light outside, you could kind of see the illumination outside from my curtain. And my curtain was just a tacked up woven blanket my grandma had made me. And there was little pockets of light shining through it. She had knitted it. I had gotten into my room, I had closed the door, and immediately I hear this like heavy breathing. And in front of me, in this outline where I can see the pockets of light of this knitted blanket, is this black figure, and it's got like these heaving shoulders with this breath. And I remember just panicking, spinning around and trying to get to the doorknob. And this room was pretty dark except for that light through the pockets of the blanket. And I remember feeling for the door and the wall feeling flat. No creases. Like my door was gone. And I'm panicking, and it just feels like every other wood paneled wall, and I'm panicking. And at some point it's finally like the doorknob's there, and I feel a hand touch my back. And I run out and I slam the door and I get on the couch, and on the computer, there's about like a quarter inch of the top of a redhead's head. My brother's like, go to bed. And he asked what was wrong with me. And he said, it looks like you've seen a ghost. It was that cliche. And he sat up with me because he was concerned, and then he quit being a boy, and then he sat up with me for a long time and until I was ready to go back to bed. The Ouija board didn't make things any better, just with everything with the vibrating bed and the bed lifting and dropping and voices. And at some point around this age, I had had so much of everything. I remember screaming at my house in a way, and I was just telling it to get out and leave me alone. And I felt this wind go through my entire body, inside, outside, pass through me and cold. And my hair moved in like this big bluster of a wind. And it was just like this, I'm not going anywhere kind of feeling. And I don't know if that's all of the entities together. I don't know if the circle of stones on a hill was a graveyard or portal, or I don't know. It was just, the whole place was insane. And for the most part, I was the only one experiencing it. By the time I had gotten to high school, I was already a weird kid. I didn't have many friends. I was very quiet. I was very reserved. I was already super into horror by this time. And I think it was because it was being able to experience that fear in a controlled environment and exploring the possibilities of what those things could have been. Most of the drug use had stopped. The harshest ones, the alcoholism was rampant, but the heavy drug use kind of stopped around middle school, high school. In middle school, I was just kind of an angry kid, and in high school, I was just really shy and quiet and bullied, and, neighbors would throw rocks at us, and we were poor, so I suppose I didn't really want to be friends with those guys anyway. But I remember in high school, I don't know, I've never had this happen again. I had episodes where I would black out and lose time and do things I didn't remember. One time, I remember this awful, awful girl just bullying me incessantly on the bus. And next thing you knew, I had blood coming from my forehead, and I had broken the bus window with my head. I would lose an entire class period of time, and I would just say really mean things to the friends I did have. And they were weird and obscure. Lots of cussing. But there were times that happened in the house too, where I would lose time. It would be like I missed hours. And I've never had that happen to me since I left that house. Ever. Ever. It was a miserable place. My mom was miserable, and I think whatever was there just ate our misery and would fan the flames. Like the misery was already there, the spark of it, but it just ignited it. And it's weird to say that I don't necessarily blame what was there, because I can't imagine what motivations they would have if they're not human. I remember my mom and dad getting divorced, and my brother and I were very relieved. And then like that, my dad quit drinking. I think my mom was really resentful that he waited until they were divorced to get better. But he would never quit his family. They also have done some awful things. Awful things. Cousins did awful things. But he got sober, and for the first time, he became my dad. It was like starting over again. And at the same time, my mother was still in the house, and she fell into a horribly dark place. She went back on some of the drugs, and all the men she was bringing over were just dreadful. And eventually, she didn't like that I mouthed off to her, and she kicked me out. And I was 17, and I had just dropped out of high school, and I went to go live with my childhood best friend and her family, and it was good. It was quiet. It was calm. It was functional. My friend's mom didn't really like me because I came from rough people, but eventually, though, my brother was still there. My brother was still living at the house at about 19, and I went back to visit and get some of my things. And he told me that he'd woken up from his room one night feeling the sensation that somebody was choking him. He woke up and he felt hands around his neck, like somebody was crushing his neck and he couldn't breathe. And he said it very clearly felt like fingers around his throat. And that was the first thing he had experienced that he told me. It had taken that long. And at the same time, I was livid because I was like, this house is going after my brother. It's trying to kill my brother. And when I visited, I was getting some stuff. I think he was gone for a little bit that day. And so I decided to sit down with the thing and be like, no, this is not happening. My brother had what was called a Newton's cradle, I think, something like that. It's one of those things that you put batteries in and it kind of keeps rotating and clicking kind of on its own and kind of has that appearance of, it kind of looks like a little solar system, but it kind of just keeps rotating. Well, I had taken the batteries out and I sat it in front of me and I said, okay, if you're so big, you're so tough, make this move. And I sat there and I was like, you show yourself now. You will not hurt my brother. And I was trying to be as assertive, but also like nervous. I'm like, that thing's going to move and I'm going to regret it. And nothing. And eventually I get sick of it and I stand up and I start to walk away and I hear tick, 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 tick. And I turn around and the thing's full on spinning on its own. And I was just like, you get out. You will never lay a hand on my brother again. Absolutely not. And I was just like, you are not allowed in his room. You are not going. And I just remember yelling at it and leaving. And he had this plaque on his door that he had carved something in woodworking. And as I turned to leave the room, it flew about 3 feet and smacked me in the back of the head. So I had made it pretty angry. And even that night, I had a dream of what looked like a little girl in a blue dress, but she just had this like solemn look on her face. And she comes up to me and she starts to try to wrap her hands around my throat. And it was that vivid. I still remember it. And I remember the dream occurred around the hill outside. And she wrapped her fingers around my throat. And I remember just like shoving her into the ground in my dream. It was really weird. And after that, he was fine. Years later, when my mom would finally admit she had seen one of them, it was cathartic, but I was mad because that whole time you pretended like I was lying and I was a kid because she was too ashamed that she was high. I will say my mom is tough. She probably endured more as a wife and a mother that I could never possibly imagine. And when I first started kind of bringing up some of the family past and tragedy, and I remember at first she would scream at me and call me a liar, and that hurt. It felt like being a kid again. And I remember being like, it's not my fault for bringing it up. It's not my fault for talking about it. It's their fault for doing it. And eventually our relationship got really strong. She admitted to some of the things, and now she looks at it and she says, I can see it now. When I look back, I can see it now. It was a sick place. I was so glad to be rid of it when it was finally sold. It sold the land, I don't know how much for, but our home, my childhood home from the time I was 4 until 17, was bought for a hunting shack for $50. I was so glad to be rid of that place. And it has affected me deeply. I'm still scared some nights that I'm going to wake up and see a 7-foot cloaked figure. I'm still afraid that I'm going to see shadow people with bright glowing red eyes. I have dreams I wake up and it starts all over again and I'm stuck back in the trailer again. And those are constant. I have anxiety, depression. Who doesn't? I have anxiety, depression, and complex PTSD. And I've worked on 5 years of cognitive behavioral therapy after my father died. I don't know if it was the family sickness or the house's sickness or just both of them just made a powder keg. I was very lucky to find a therapist who believed my experiences. She had also experienced some strange things in her life. And it wasn't about telling me I was crazy. It was just giving me the tools to deal with how I knew my life to be. And so when I hear people try to get therapy when they have their experiences, no matter what they are, and they're not believed by their mental health professionals, that breaks my heart because I don't think they're doing a very good job of helping you if the first thing they feel is that they don't believe in you. And I've had paranormal experiences my whole life. I jokingly have what I call a roommate, though I think he's mostly gone now. That might be a story for another time. But the things I've gone through have finally led me to have kind of a peace with it. And so fear doesn't rule me so much now, but I still think I'm going to wake up someday and be back in that house and it's all going to start over again. Years later, I have a friend who I genuinely believe has some psychic gifts, whatever that may be. I think we're all sort of connected in some way, spiritually or consciously. I don't know. I like to have ideas, not necessarily beliefs. I try not to be too dogmatic on anything. And he told me, he said, you have a lot of good energies around you. I think that he knew my great-grandmother on my mother's side was there with me. And then also he's like, there's a man who seems like a fatherly figure that looks at you like he shouldn't, if that makes any sense. And I just knew it was my grandfather, like in the gut. He said, yeah, he doesn't like it when you fight with your father. So, and this is when my dad was still alive. He said, yeah, so on a rare occasion, I would still get my bed lifted and dropped and get the side of it kicked in the middle of the night, even into my 20s. And he goes, yeah, he's been doing that your whole life. He's been lifting your bed and dropping it. He's been kicking your bed and messing with your sleep this whole time. And I had this massive family photo. My dad's family is very big, and there's a big picture of uncles and everything. And he just points to my grandfather in a snap. He said, that's him. And he's like, you can tell him he's not allowed in your life at all, that he has no say, and you can tell him to get out of your space and leave you alone. It was the worst when I lived in the house, but ever since I went and told him to bugger off, I've never had my bed kicked or lifted or anything ever since. And I know he was around when my father was dying of cancer. I felt like it was him, and that's a strange thing to say, like when you just innately feel something and know something. When my dad was very close to death, I would hear coughing constantly coming from his basement and just coughing and hacking and coughing. And I felt like it was my grandfather. I remember telling my mom about it, and she says, well, you know, he died of lung cancer, right? I am 30 years old, and this is the first time I know my grandfather has died of lung cancer. It's those kind of things that they line up too well. And it was weird land. And the very last thing I kind of remembered that happened on the exterior of the house that was just strange was one of the days before I got kicked out. My brother had seen it too, was above the house. It looked like a storm, but it wasn't a storm. It was a patch of clouds just surrounding the house that looked like apocalyptic. The colors, it was pink and purples and blues, and it just, the best way I can describe it is if you've ever looked up what a vortex looks like in the sky, it was that, but all clustered together in this huge mess, and they were all turning in different directions, and it was like this constantly mad swirling gasoline puddle, and it just, I've never seen anything like it since, and I just felt like the sky was going to open up and swallow me. And my brother and I, he's like, let's go. And we got into his car and we drove probably down the road about half a mile. And we're looking at it, and it's just this patch above the house, just surrounding the house. And it's so weird. And I remember just, that place just only got weirder and weirder. But getting kicked out was probably the best thing that could have happened to me at that time, because I genuinely think that place was trying to kill me. Recently, I've been opening up about the human trauma of it. And my brother doesn't talk to me anymore. He doesn't want to look at it. And so he doesn't want to talk to me. I have a niece and a nephew, and I've never met them. And on occasion, he'll write and tell me he loves me, but he won't. He and I haven't had a conversation in 4 years. I love my brother. He's a good man. He's a good dad. And I guess in a way, maybe he needed to separate from me so he could finally be free. I still see things, hear things. Sometimes they're cosmically beautiful. I've been my mental health professional. I was worried about schizophrenia, but my brain doctor and my medicine doctor, that's real backwoodsy sounding, both are like, no, that's kind of really not how it works. So I've been able to talk about the human trauma of it all. This is the part I haven't been able to talk about. This is the inhuman part of the trauma growing up. And it's all just shadows at this point. I do feel strangely good right now, which I didn't think I would, but the last thing I remember was telling that thing to leave my brother alone. And my mom stayed, and she became monstrous for a short amount of time. I think the house tried to kill her too. And after she left, it was so different. She still struggled for a long time, but I got my first apology for how she was after the divorce when I was about 30 years old. Right around when my father passed away, she said she was sorry for how that went. That was the thickest black of it, though, were those years that I lived in that house. It was a nightmare. Every day was a nightmare for years. I wish I had a better way of kind of putting that, but yeah, that's the gist. That's what happened to me.
If you've had a paranormal experience and would like to be a guest on the show, please contact us by going to myparax.com. That's myparaex.com. Thanks for listening.